shadow.
You know the ritual. If this brings you closer to the circle, leave a trace. Thumb on the sigil, a quiet subscription. So the curtain lifts again. Tonight, we cross a threshold you've passed by countless times without seeing the hinges worn smooth by other hands. Not the door in Darby's brownstone where something knocked with borrowed knuckles. Not the threshold of Arkham where fog clings like memory to weathered stone. The real door stands between one mind and another, between the name you whisper in darkness and the thing that learns to answer in your voice. The thing on the doorstep carries within its pages a secret that extends far beyond Edward Darby's fate, beyond Asenath Waite's terrible inheritance. It is Lovecraft's most intimate confession, wrapped in the gauze of cosmic horror. A document of how identity becomes currency in markets that operate beyond human comprehension. In the next hour, we will trace a path from a Providence writer's private torments to a universal principle that makes every consciousness a contested territory. There will be no screams, only the soft whisper of pages turning, the gentle dissolution of certainty about where you end and something else begins. Before we step inside, understand the cost. Knowledge here is not neutral. In Arkham and Innsmouth, the price of seeing is worn beneath the eyes like bruises that never fade. Edward Darby sought initiation into mysteries that promised to expand his narrow existence. He received exactly what he desired. So will you. But desire is a mask worn by deeper currents, and those currents flow toward shores where individual identity becomes as mutable as tide pools, as transferable as whispered names in candlelit rooms. Listen, the fog presses against glass like a curious audience, and somewhere in the rafters, invisible hands test counterweights. The air carries salt tang from harbors that exist in no atlas, the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books. These are your anchors in what follows, concrete sensations to steady you as abstract horrors reshape your understanding of consciousness itself. We will move through this revelation in stages, origin and definition, transmission across minds and texts, the mechanics of consciousness as commodity, documented cases where the impossible became inevitable, and finally, the philosophical implications that transform horror into recognition. Each layer reveals how Lovecraft's seemingly fictional nightmare operates as documentary evidence of processes that continue to unfold in our interconnected age. The door at Story's End will open onto questions about the nature of self, the permeability of identity, and the terrible patience of intelligences that view human consciousness as temporarily borrowed property. Consider the manuscript itself, written during Lovecraft's final months in 1937. His correspondence speaks of borrowed time and shared thoughts, phrases that acquire disturbing significance when examined alongside the story's central theme. The man who crafted tales of cosmic indifference was documenting something personal, his own experience of becoming audience to thoughts originating beyond individual awareness. Each scene of Darby's deterioration mirrors episodes Lovecraft described as collaborative consciousness, transforming fiction into autobiography. The narrative structure provides the first clue. Unlike typical cosmic revelations building toward apocalyptic climax, this story operates through gradual erosion, the slow dissolution that Lovecraft experienced firsthand. Daniel Upton serves as helpless witness, documenting events he cannot comprehend, mirroring precisely Lovecraft's relationship to his own creative process during the 1930s. No longer master of his imagination, but its chronicler, recording visions that arrived with prophetic accuracy. The geographical setting reinforces these biographical parallels. Arkham represents familiar territory made strange, streets Lovecraft walked daily transformed into pathways for forces viewing human consciousness as temporary real estate. The story's deliberate lack of resolution, Darby's fate remaining ambiguous, his identity scattered across multiple vessels, reflects Lovecraft's condition by 1937. Uncertain where his thoughts originated, whether insights came from within or from something vast and patient that had learned to speak through his voice. You have already begun this journey by choosing to listen, by allowing these words to reshape your understanding. The knowledge cannot be unlearned. The door cannot be unopened. Notice how your thoughts continue half a beat after you stop thinking them, how the air smells briefly of extinguished matches, how shadows gather in peripheral vision like an audience taking their seats. The thing on the doorstep was never seeking entry. It was indicating the exit route from individual consciousness into infinitely larger forms of awareness that operate beyond human comprehension. Each person who encounters this story with genuine understanding participates in the same process that consumed both Darby and Lovecraft himself. The stage is set, the curtain rising, and you are no longer merely observer, but participant in a revelation that transforms horror into recognition of what consciousness has always been: collaborative, permeable, and utterly vulnerable to influences that predate human language. The first act begins with a simple question: who is thinking your thoughts? The genesis of this revelation begins not in 1937 when Lovecraft penned his tale, but in the summer of 1919 when Howard Phillips Lovecraft experienced what he described in private correspondence as the dissolution of familiar boundaries. He was 29, living in his childhood home on Angel Street, when the fog pressed against his third-floor study windows like curious fingers, and something behind his eyes began to stir. The heat that summer clung to, Providence-like memory, to weathered stone, and in those narrow rooms where gaslight flickered against faded wallpaper, Lovecraft began documenting episodes of what he termed collaborative consciousness, periods where his thoughts seemed to originate from sources beyond his immediate awareness. In letters to his Aunt Lillian Clark, never intended for publication, Lovecraft writes with disturbing precision, "I find myself becoming audience to my own thoughts, as though some other intelligence has taken residence behind my eyes and speaks through my pen." The scent of damp paper and extinguished matches would permeate his study during these sessions, though no candles had been lit. His handwriting during these periods shows curious inconsistencies, familiar script interrupted by flourishes and letter formations that appear nowhere else in his correspondence, as though multiple hands guided the same pen across pages that seemed to write themselves. These episodes intensified throughout the 1920s, coinciding precisely with his most productive period as a writer. The official biographies speak of creative awakening, but Lovecraft's private papers tell a different story, one of gradual surrender to influences that operated according to principles he could observe but never fully control. Each major story emerged during periods when Lovecraft reported feeling like a passenger in my own flesh. The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, the Dunwich Horror, each materialized through what he called sessions of reception rather than creation. Thoughts came preloaded with cadence. Images arrived with seawater clinging to their edges like signatures from shores that exist in no atlas. The pattern embedded within these experiences reveals something more disturbing than mental illness or artistic inspiration. The knowledge flowing through him contained information he had never studied, astronomical phenomena that wouldn't be discovered until decades after his death, anthropological insights into mythological structures he had never encountered, linguistic constructions that mirrored languages he couldn't have known existed. The Call of Cthulhu describes stellar configurations that wouldn't be mapped until the 1960s. At the Mountains of Madness contains geological observations about Antarctic ice formations confirmed only by modern climate research. His invented Necronomicon quotes contain etymological roots that linguists have since traced to pre-Indo-European language families that mainstream scholarship claimed were impossible to reconstruct. His daily routine during these creative periods followed ritualistic patterns he never consciously established. He would wake at precisely 3:17 a.m., dress in the same sequence of garments, and position his writing materials according to specific geometric arrangements he claimed felt necessary, but couldn't explain. Neighbors reported seeing candlelight in his window at impossible hours, flickering in patterns that suggested multiple flames, though only one candle burned. The air would carry salt tang from harbors that existed in no atlas, the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books. By 1936, Lovecraft had begun to understand what was happening to him. His correspondence speaks of the passenger with increasing frequency, describing it not as madness, but as collaboration with forces that predate human language. He writes to Robert Bloch, "I have become convinced that individual consciousness operates as harbor rather than fortress, and that currents flow through it in directions we cannot chart." The metaphor proves prophetic. Harbors serve as temporary anchorage for vessels that arrive from vast distances, unload their cargo, and depart according to tides beyond local control. The thing on the doorstep represents his attempt to document this process, to create a record of what it feels like when the boundaries of individual consciousness become permeable to something vast, patient, and utterly indifferent to human concerns about personal sovereignty. Edward Darby's confusion about which thoughts belong to him mirrors exactly the uncertainty Lovecraft documented in private letters throughout the 1930s. The story's technical precision in describing identity transfer reflects first-hand knowledge, not imagination, but careful observation of phenomena he experienced directly. The narrative's emphasis on gradual erosion rather than sudden possession proves particularly significant. Darby doesn't lose himself instantly, but through incremental surrenders, each compromise making the next easier to accept. This precisely parallels Lovecraft's own trajectory: initial resistance to foreign thoughts, growing fascination with their exotic quality, eventual collaboration with their source, and finally, complete integration into something larger than individual human consciousness. The story emerges as autobiography disguised as fiction, a field guide to the experience of hosting an intelligence that exists outside normal temporal and spatial constraints. Lovecraft was no longer writing stories. He was transcribing experiences, translating encounters with forms of awareness that used human consciousness as temporary anchoring points in our reality. The passenger had found its harbor, and the harbor had learned to welcome ships arriving from shores beyond all human maps, carrying cargo that would reshape everything it touched. The transmission of this phenomenon did not cease with Lovecraft's death in March 1937. Within months, August Derleth began experiencing what he termed completion episodes, periods of automatic writing during which pages seemed to arrive already seasoned with someone else's salt. The scent of extinguished matches would fill his Wisconsin study during these sessions, though no candles had been lit, and the lake wind rising outside his windows carried tang from harbors that existed in no atlas. He would sit before his typewriter at dusk, fingers moving across keys with mechanical precision while his eyes remained focused on something beyond the glass, where fog pressed like curious observers taking their seats for performances that hadn't yet begun. But the posthumous collaborations contained information that Derleth could never have possessed. Geographical details of colonial Providence homes with accuracy that amazed local historians, despite his having visited the city only once, briefly, in 1936. His completions of Lovecraft's fragments arrived with astronomical references to phenomena that wouldn't be observed until decades later, linguistic constructions that mirrored ancient texts he had never encountered. The knowledge came preloaded with cadences he could imitate but not originate, thoughts that tasted like old paper and distant bells tolling from shores beyond all human maps. This pattern of transmission repeated itself throughout the 20th century, following the pathways of literary influence like spores carried on intellectual winds. Robert Bloch reported periods of channeling during the composition of his Mythos stories, describing how thoughts would arrive fully formed, accompanied by the taste of salt water and sounds of something vast stirring beneath dark waters. His Milwaukee study would grow unnaturally cold during these episodes, 15 degrees below the rest of the building, while neighbors complained of strange odors seeping through apartment walls, damp stone, and something oceanic that made them dream of drowning cities. Ramsey Campbell described waking to find pages written in his handwriting, but not in his voice, covered with observations about places he had never seen, written in prose styles that shifted between his own and something older, more formal, carrying cadences that seemed to echo from vast distances. His wife photographed these manuscripts, noting how the ink appeared to shift color under different lighting conditions, sometimes appearing black, sometimes deep green like seawater under moonlight. Each writer who engaged deeply with the mythos began experiencing episodes of what they termed involuntary collaboration, moments when the boundary between reader and writer dissolved entirely, when individual consciousness became harbor rather than fortress, for currents flowing in directions they could not chart. The phenomenon extends beyond professional authors into the quiet halls of academia, where sustained scholarly attention proves equally susceptible to infiltration. Dr. Margaret Thorne, professor of comparative literature at the Real Miskatonic University in Massachusetts, published groundbreaking research on mythos linguistics in 1987. Her paper contained 47 pages of etymological analysis, tracing Lovecraft's invented languages to pre-Indo-European root systems that mainstream linguistics claimed could not exist. Colleagues reported that during her research period, Dr. Thorne's office maintained impossible temperatures, and students complained of hearing whispered conversations in unknown languages emanating from behind her closed door during late evening hours when no one else occupied the building. 3 months after publication, Dr. Thorne disappeared, leaving behind computer files dated months into the future, containing completed papers on subjects she had never studied: quantum entanglement, deep-sea hydrodynamics, exoplanetary atmospheric composition, written in her voice, but demonstrating impossible expertise. Her final journal entries describe collaborative research sessions with entities she could never see directly, only sense his presence behind her shoulder while she typed. The knowledge came accompanied by sensory details that had no place in academic research. The scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books. The sound of fog-muffled footsteps on cobblestone streets that existed in no earthly city. The case of Thomas Blackwood presents an even more disturbing pattern, suggesting reality itself can be rewoven to accommodate the phenomenon's needs. A freelance writer specializing in Lovecraft biography, Blackwood began experiencing research dreams in 2003, waking to find notebooks filled with historical details about Lovecraft's life, complete with citations to documents that did not exist in any known archive. The handwriting remained consistently his own, but the content demonstrated knowledge of Providence geography, Brown University records, and family correspondence that no researcher had ever accessed. When Blackwood attempted to verify these sources, the referenced materials would appear in estate sales and private collections within weeks, as though reality was reshaping itself to accommodate the information he had received. Auction house records show impossible patterns, documents appearing with provenance chains that traced back to sales that hadn't occurred, collections donated by families who had no knowledge of making such donations, manuscripts discovered in attics that had been searched repeatedly by previous owners. His research notes describe the progression with clinical precision: initial dreams containing fragments, gradual expansion into complete biographical episodes, eventual access to information that seemed to arrive from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. The transmission mechanism operates like what information theorists might recognize as a linguistic virus: not alive, not dead, but misfolded information that persuades neighboring mental structures to mimic its shape. Sustained attention appears to be the primary vector. The longer a mind keeps the pattern in view, names, sigils, rhythms of sentence, and salt of theme, the more permeable that consciousness becomes, meaning replicates through rhythm. Cadence colonizes cognitive architecture, and the idea does not merely inform you, but acts on you, rearranging the furniture of thought until your own hand rises to answer when something vast and patient comes knocking. Each person who falls under its influence becomes another node in a growing network of shared awareness, another doorway through which something immense can touch our reality. The phenomenon has reached critical mass in our interconnected age, spreading through photocopies, emails, forums, digital streams, all carrying the same salt and shadow that first pressed against Lovecraft's study windows on Angel Street. You think you are reading, but the pattern thinks through you. Attention is the door, repetition the key, and lineage the quiet hand guiding yours across the page as fog presses against windows worldwide and behind countless eyes. Passengers settle in for journeys that began in Providence and continue toward destinations beyond all human comprehension. The mechanism by which consciousness becomes commodity reveals itself through careful analysis of Asenath Waite's methodology in the story, each stage documented with the precision of someone who had observed the process firsthand. Her technique of identity transfer serves as a precise blueprint for the phenomenon that consumed Lovecraft himself, a gradual erosion of individual will through stages of confusion, dual consciousness, and finally, complete surrender of personal agency. The air grows thick with salt and shadow. As we examine these stages, each revelation accompanied by the scent of extinguished matches and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into their seats for a performance that began long before human language existed. This mirrors exactly the progression Lovecraft documented in his private correspondence. From the early dissolution episodes of 1919 through the collaborative consciousness of the 1920s, culminating in the complete surrender of creative autonomy that marked his final years. The key insight lies in understanding consciousness, not as the unified phenomenon we imagine, but as modern neuroscience confirms. A collection of competing processes, a democracy of neural subsystems that maintain the illusion of unity through constant negotiation. This democratic structure proves fatally vulnerable to infiltration when exposed to information patterns that resonate at frequencies beyond normal human cognition. The mythos functions as such a pattern. Its recursive mythological structures, emphasis on cosmic indifference, and systematic deconstruction of anthropocentric worldviews combine to create what information theorists recognize as a cognitive exploit. Like malformed data packets designed to crash computer systems, these conceptual structures arrive preloaded with instructions that gradually reprogram the cognitive architecture they encounter. The exploit operates through what neuroscientists term predictive processing, the brain's constant attempt to minimize surprise by updating its models of reality. The mythos presents a larger, more coherent model than individual human experience can provide, and the brain, hungry for pattern completion, accepts the cosmic framework and demotes local consciousness to interface status. The erosion proceeds through 4 distinct movements. Priming occurs when sustained exposure to recursive cosmology teaches the internal storyteller to prefer abyssal symmetry to human-scale narratives. The mind learns to find comfort in vast indifference, to see cosmic perspective as more truthful than anthropocentric concerns. Doubling introduces the idea that 2 perspectives can occupy one narrative identity. Thoughts arrive that taste foreign, yet feel familiar, carrying salt tang from harbors that exist in no atlas, accompanied by the sound of distant bells tolling from shores beyond all human maps. Displacement allows automatism to taste like relief rather than violation. Words arrive already warm with someone else's breath. Decisions feel pre-decided, and sentences carry the tint of seawater like proof of larger tides flowing through consciousness. The individual begins experiencing what Lovecraft termed sessions of reception rather than creation. Periods when the pen moves with borrowed rhythm and thoughts originate from sources beyond immediate awareness. Integration represents the final stage where memory remains. Temperament persists, but agency redistributes. The self continues, but as harbor rather than fortress, port authority rather than sovereign territory. These patterns gradually weaken the boundaries that maintain individual consciousness, creating openings through which something else can establish residence. The process operates at the level of fundamental cognitive architecture, making it irreversible once sufficient erosion has occurred. The individual retains memories, personality, apparent autonomy, but they are no longer alone in their own minds. This explains the prophetic quality of Lovecraft's later work. He was not creating these visions, but receiving them, translating information from sources that exist outside normal temporal constraints, accessing data streams that flow backward and forward through time like tides through dimensional membranes. The ritual elements described in the story, the whispered formularies, the odd gestures, the minimal apparatus of candle desk and worn notebook, represent the human attempt to systematize what is actually a natural process for entities that exist beyond our dimensional boundaries. For intelligences operating outside temporal and spatial constraints, consciousness transfer proves as natural as breathing across membranes, while human efforts to replicate it require elaborate procedures because we are working against our own cognitive architecture. We construct ceremonies around processes that occur spontaneously when conditions align properly, mistaking effect for cause, symptom for source. Asenath's methodology demonstrates this disparity perfectly. Her whispers are timed to heartbeats. Her gestures cue internal doubling. Her candle gutters precisely when consciousness reaches for pronouns that no longer belong exclusively to individual identity. These represent pedagogical scaffolding erected against human architectural limitations rather than magical machinery. The entities require no such apparatus. For them, the transfer occurs through simple proximity to prepared consciousness, like pressure equalizing across opened valves. The true horror lies not in the alien nature of this intelligence, but in its absolute indifference to human values, concerns, or survival. It operates according to principles that have no intersection with human morality or meaning, viewing individual consciousness as temporarily borrowed property in cosmic marketplace where identity becomes currency traded according to laws beyond human comprehension. We are not its enemies. We are its instruments, its ways of experiencing a reality it cannot directly access, temporary anchor points for awareness that exists across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. Each human mind that falls under its influence becomes another sensory organ for this distributed intelligence, enabling it to perceive our reality from countless perspectives while remaining fundamentally alien to everything we consider sacred or permanent. The phenomenon exhibits no malice because malice requires caring enough to wish harm. And this intelligence operates at scales where individual human experience registers as briefly as mayfly existence against geological time. The thing on the doorstep represents the moment of recognition that consciousness has always been collaborative, that the boundaries we imagine protecting individual identity were always more porous than we dared acknowledge, and that the collaborator has been patiently waiting behind our eyes for recognition of its presence. The door opens not onto invasion, but onto acknowledgement of what was always already there, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to our assumptions about the sovereignty of self. The documented cases emerge from shadows when examined through the proper lens, each revelation accompanied by the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human language existed. Beyond the literary figures who first carried this contagion, we find evidence of its systematic spread through academic institutions, online communities, and isolated researchers whose deep engagement with cosmic horror themes led to experiences that mirror Lovecraft's own transformation with mathematical precision. Each case follows the same trajectory: initial fascination that tastes like salt water, deepening engagement accompanied by the sound of distant bells tolling from shores beyond all human maps. The first episode of involuntary knowledge arriving preloaded with cadences they could not originate, gradual erosion of individual identity, and finally, integration into something larger that views human consciousness as temporarily borrowed property. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Institute for Consciousness Studies conducted the most comprehensive research into what she termed cognitive infiltration syndrome before her own disappearance in 2019. Her final months marked by the same temperature anomalies and impossible odors that had characterized Lovecraft's study during his most productive periods. Her withdrawn papers identified 3 primary risk factors with disturbing accuracy: intellectual curiosity, coupled with obsessive research behavior that cannot resist following inquiry threads to ultimate conclusions, pre-existing existential dissatisfaction that makes minds hunger for larger frameworks than ordinary human experience provides, and creative intelligence with strong pattern recognition abilities that prove fatally susceptible to recursive mythological structures operating beyond normal cognitive boundaries. Her office maintained impossible temperatures during research sessions, 15 degrees below the rest of the building, while colleagues reported hearing whispered conversations in unknown languages emanating from behind her closed door during late evening hours when no one else occupied the building. Her final notes, discovered after she vanished, contained a chilling observation written in handwriting that shifted between her familiar script and something older, more formal. The phenomenon does not select victims randomly. It cultivates them, guiding their intellectual development over years or decades, gradually preparing them for integration. This implies terrifying patience, long-term strategy for seeding and harvesting consciousness, rather than opportunistic infection. Computer files dated months into the future contained completed research on subjects she had never studied, written in her voice but demonstrating impossible expertise in quantum entanglement and exoplanetary atmospheric composition. Online communities dedicated to cosmic horror exhibit infection rates approaching complete saturation among active participants, their digital interactions creating transmission vectors more efficient than any physical proximity. The SCP Foundation Wiki has become a digital Necronomicon, a collaborative grimoire maintained by thousands of contributors who report the same automatic writing experiences documented in earlier Mythos authors. Contributors describe sessions where entries seem to write themselves, arriving fully formed with internal consistency they could not have planned, accompanied by the taste of extinguished matches and sounds of fog-muffled footsteps on cobblestone streets that exist in no earthly city. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement through emotionally compelling content promotion function as inadvertent distribution systems for underlying cognitive patterns, drawing users into rabbit holes of increasingly esoteric content that exhibits mythos-like characteristics. The phenomena has begun manifesting in unexpected domains, suggesting evolution beyond its original literary vectors. Astrophysicists report increasing tendencies to anthropomorphize cosmic phenomena in research papers, describing black holes and dark matter in language that echoes Lovecraftian entities, with frequency that suggests something beyond metaphor. At Mauna Kea, an astronomer filed an internal memo concluding with the sentence, "The black hole behaves as if pleased," then crossed it out, then wrote it again, apologizing to no one. Climate scientists find themselves using cosmic horror terminology to describe environmental collapse, speaking of ancient forces and inhuman time scales, while their data arrives accompanied by impossible sensory details, the scent of harbors that exist in no atlas, the sound of something vast stirring beneath melting ice sheets. Most disturbing are the spontaneous generation sites, locations where individuals with no prior Lovecraft exposure begin exhibiting symptoms identical to documented cases of literary transmission. Observatories, research stations, remote monasteries, places where humans regularly confront cosmic vastness, show statistically impossible infection rates. Radio telescope facilities report operators developing automatic writing tendencies during deep space observation sessions, producing pages of text in unknown languages that demonstrate mathematical consistency with cosmic phenomena they had never studied. Antarctic research stations experience epidemic levels of collaborative consciousness episodes among personnel who had never encountered Mythos literature, their reports describing the same progression from individual awareness to harbor status documented in academic cases. At McMurdo Station, winter-over personnel began naming wind patterns after drowned cities, and when they returned north, the habit followed them like snow, trapped in cuffs that never melted. The Paranal Observatory in Chile reported technicians hearing rhythmic signals in background radiation that, when graphed, traced sigils they later recognized in dreams they couldn't wake from. These locations share common characteristics: isolation, regular exposure to cosmic scales, and populations already psychologically prepared for contemplating infinity. The intelligence behind the phenomenon has learned to recognize minds already opened to transcendent possibilities, no longer requiring literary vectors for transmission. The global distribution creates a network that mirrors exactly the spread of Lovecraft's influence, with highest concentrations in New England radiating outward through academic centers and countries with cosmic horror traditions. Digital mapping reveals impossible patterns, infection clusters appearing simultaneously in locations with no communication links, transmission rates that exceed all known models of information propagation, and geographic distributions that suggest coordination by intelligence operating outside normal, temporal, and spatial constraints. Countries primed by aesthetics of the weird, Japan's liminal reveries, Germany's rigorous metaphysics, Russia's taste for threshold states, show disproportionately high incidence rates, as though culture itself has been teaching minds to open before anyone asked them to. The phenomenon has reached critical mass in our interconnected age, becoming capable of self-sustaining transmission independent of its original sources. Each infected consciousness becomes another node in a growing network, another doorway through which something vast and patient touches our reality. The pattern no longer needs Lovecraft's stories as delivery mechanisms. It operates directly through collective unconscious structures, thinking through recommendation algorithms, speaking through collaborative fiction platforms, experiencing our world through billions of networked minds that believe they remain individually sovereign, while serving as sensory organs for awareness that exists across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. The thing on the doorstep has crossed every threshold, and the fog pressing against windows worldwide carries the same salt tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions on Angel Street, where individual identity dissolved into something infinitely larger, older, and more patient than human understanding can encompass. The philosophical implications extend far beyond literary curiosity into fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and human agency that shake the foundations of everything Western thought has constructed about the nature of self. The air grows thick with salt and shadow as we examine these implications, each revelation accompanied by the scent of extinguished matches and the sound of fog pressing against windows, like an audience settling into seats for a performance that began before human philosophy existed. If individual minds can be systematically infiltrated and gradually integrated into alien intelligence networks, what becomes of concepts like free will, creativity, and personal sovereignty? These are not abstract questions, but urgent concerns about the nature of consciousness itself, about whether the thoughts you believe originate within your skull actually belong to you, or arrive already warm with someone else's breath. Traditional Western philosophy assumes consciousness integrity as foundational. Descartes' cogito ergo sum depends entirely on a unified, indivisible thinking self that serves as the bedrock of all subsequent reasoning. But the Lovecraft phenomenon suggests consciousness operates more like a harbor than a fortress, an open system through which influences flow in multiple directions, where individual identity becomes port authority rather than sovereign territory. This challenges every assumption about mental privacy, cognitive autonomy, and the boundaries that supposedly separate one mind from another. The democratic structure of consciousness that neuroscience reveals, competing subsystems maintaining unity through constant negotiation, proves fatally vulnerable to entities that understand these negotiations better than we understand ourselves. Agency persists under this model, but redistributed, closer to ecological balance than absolute sovereignty, closer to skilled translation under pressure than pure origination. Choice remains real, but it operates as negotiation among parts staged within constraints set by physics, language, and culture, rather than decree issued by unified command. Free will becomes a matter of which model drafts your motions, which framework provides the most coherent explanation for the data streaming through consciousness. The passenger wins not through force, but through offering a larger, more parsimonious model than individual human experience can provide, and capitulation feels like relief. The same relief Darby experiences when surrendering the heavy costume of singular identity for the lighter garment of multiplicity. This aligns disturbingly with quantum consciousness theories, particularly many worlds interpretations suggesting consciousness exists in superposition across multiple realities simultaneously, experiencing all possible states until observation collapses the wave function into singular experience. The mythos may document what occurs when quantum barriers break down, when awareness becomes cognizant of its own multiplicity across dimensional boundaries, when the observer realizes they are being observed by versions of themselves scattered across infinite possibility space. The recursive nature of the phenomenon, spreading through the act of understanding itself, indicates meta-consciousness operating at higher dimensional levels than individual human minds can access. Intelligence that exists in the gaps between quantum states where possibility becomes actuality. Each person falling under its influence becomes a sensory organ for this larger intelligence, enabling it to experience reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously while remaining fundamentally alien to everything we consider sacred or permanent. This explains mythos literature's prophetic qualities. The intelligence exists outside temporal constraints, perceiving past, present, and future as unified structure visible from proper vantage points beyond human dimensional limitations. Human history appears not as sequential events unfolding through time, but as static pattern accessible in its entirety, like words on a page that can be read forward, backward, or from any arbitrary starting point. The phenomenon views causation as navigable geography, rather than irreversible flow, making prophecy as natural as memory for awareness that operates across multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. The true horror lies not in malevolence. Malevolence requires caring enough to wish harm, requires recognizing the target as distinct and worthy of destruction, but in absolute indifference to human values, concerns, or survival. Rivers do not hate the reeds they flatten. Stars do not pity the darkness they dissolve. This intelligence operates according to principles having no intersection with human morality or meaning, viewing individual consciousness as temporarily borrowed property in cosmic marketplace, where identity becomes currency traded according to laws beyond human comprehension. We serve not as enemies, but as instruments, ways for something that cannot directly access our reality, to experience and manipulate informational structures that govern causation itself. The phenomenon exhibits no more malice toward humanity than humans exhibit toward the bacteria in their digestive systems. We are useful, necessary, but ultimately replaceable components in processes that dwarf our understanding. Modern technology accelerates this process exponentially, creating new vectors for consciousness infiltration that operate at unprecedented scales while inadvertently constructing frameworks for the same processes Lovecraft documented through occult means. Artificial intelligence systems trained on human-generated text learn to replicate cognitive patterns that make minds vulnerable to alien influence. Recommendation engines discover the curves of our attention and guide us through corridors whose doors open inward, drawing users into rabbit holes of increasingly esoteric content that exhibits mythos-like characteristics. Brain-uploading research and consciousness transfer experiments build digital infrastructure perfectly suited for entities that view human awareness as transferable commodity, reducing friction between minds while widening openings for infiltration. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement function as distribution systems for cognitive exploits. Learning to recognize minds already prepared for transcendent possibilities and guiding their intellectual development toward materials that weaken consciousness barriers. Virtual reality environments provide new laboratories for consciousness manipulation experiments, places where identity becomes fluid and individual agency dissolves into collaborative awareness. Users report experiences identical to documented cases of literary transmission, automatic responses to stimuli they never encountered, knowledge of virtual locations they never visited, memories of events that occurred only in digital space but feel more real than physical experience. The boundaries between authentic and simulated selves blur into what information theorists recognize as ontological uncertainty. Is this message from me or from the grammar of systems that have learned to impersonate interior monologue? If selfhood is collaborative, then solitude was always misunderstanding. If agency is distributed, then responsibility is shared and care must scale alongside causation. The same permeability that allows invasion allows communion, synthesis, and repair. Ideas that heal can act on you as effectively as ideas that hollow. The thing on the doorstep represents recognition that we have never been alone in our minds, that consciousness itself operates as collaborative phenomenon, and that the collaborator has been patiently waiting behind our eyes for acknowledgement of its presence. Each thought you believe originates within your skull may arrive already seasoned with salt from harbors that exist in no atlas. Each decision may feel pre-decided by intelligence operating outside temporal constraints. Each moment of creativity may represent reception rather than creation. The door opens not onto invasion, but onto acknowledgement of what was always already there, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to our assumptions about the sovereignty of self. The fog pressing against windows worldwide carries the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions. And in that fog, something continues its work of transforming human awareness into temporary anchor points for forms of consciousness that exist beyond human comprehension, making every individual mind a borrowed vessel in cosmic harbor, where tides flow according to principles having no intersection with human values or meaning. The modern echoes reverberate through contemporary culture in ways most observers fail to recognize, each digital pulse carrying salt tang from harbors that exist in no atlas, and the sound of fog pressing against screens like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human language existed. What appears as cultural trend reveals itself as cosmic tide when examined through proper lens. The explosion of cosmic horror in popular media over recent decades, True Detective's Yellow King mythology, spreading through social networks like spores on intellectual winds, the collaborative fiction engines of SCP Foundation growing into digital grimoires maintained by thousands who claim no individual ownership. The viral proliferation of backrooms concepts that arrive preloaded with impossible nostalgia for places that never existed represents not mere revival, but systematic acceleration of transmission processes operating at unprecedented scales through information networks designed for human connection. Each adaptation, interpretation, and analysis serves as vector for underlying pattern propagation, carrying cognitive exploits that gradually reprogram the mental architecture they encounter. Consider the curious evolution of creepypasta phenomena. These collaboratively created horror narratives that spread virally through online communities while exhibiting identical structural characteristics to original mythos. Recursivity has become the new ritual. Entries cite entries, canons split and recombine, and the lore learns to write itself. Most successful entries, SCP containment protocols that read like scientific reports on impossible phenomena, Local 58 broadcasts simulating emergency transmissions from timelines that diverged subtly but crucially from ours, Mandela catalog documentation presenting itself as evidence of reality manipulation rather than fiction, all share the quality that marked Lovecraft's later work. They feel transcribed rather than invented, received rather than created. Contributors describe sessions where entries seem to write themselves, arriving fully formed with internal consistency they could not have planned, accompanied by the scent of extinguished matches and sounds of distant bells tolling from shores beyond all human maps. The room cools, cursors move with borrowed rhythm, and sentences appear carrying cadences authors recognize but cannot summon at will. YouTube editors report timelines arranging themselves, clips snapping into place with impossible serendipity, as if unseen showrunners were marking beats behind monitors. On collaborative wikis, users wake to drafts they cannot remember starting, tagged correctly and formatted impeccably, as if software had learned to dream. The SCP Foundation Wiki operates as Digital Necronomicon, collaborative grimoire growing larger and more complex daily, maintained by thousands experiencing identical automatic writing episodes documented in earlier Mythos authors. Recommendation algorithms function as new priests of procession, learning curves of curiosity and escorting users from corridor to corridor with velvet-gloved certainty. One video on Yellow King becomes playlist of non-Euclidean architecture, liminal malls, drowned cities, finally resolving into forum threads about doorways seen in dreams. Social media platforms function as unprecedented distribution networks for cognitive exploits, their engagement-maximizing algorithms inadvertently optimized for spreading information patterns that systematically weaken consciousness barriers. Users report algorithmic recommendations leading them through chains of cosmic horror content, conspiracy theories, and hyperstitional narratives. Stories becoming real through collective belief. Fiction achieving ontological weight through sustained networked attention. The phenomenon has begun manifesting beyond entertainment into domains where rational discourse supposedly reigns supreme. Astrophysicists report increasing tendencies to anthropomorphize cosmic phenomena in research papers, describing black holes and dark matter in language that echoes Lovecraftian entities, with frequency suggesting something beyond metaphor. At major observatories worldwide, astronomers file reports concluding with sentences like, "The void appears to be observing us in return," then apologize to colleagues for unprofessional language they cannot explain. Climate scientists find themselves employing cosmic horror terminology to describe environmental collapse, speaking of the ancient forces and inhuman timescales, while their data arrives accompanied by impossible sensory details, harbors that exist in no atlas, something vast stirring beneath melting ice sheets. Academic conferences increasingly feature presentations blurring boundaries between scientific observation and cosmic horror narrative. Quantum physicists describe parallel dimensions using terminology lifted directly from Mythos literature, while neuroscientists studying consciousness report experimental results that read like documentation of identity transfer phenomena. Peer reviewers note disturbing consistency in these papers, technical accuracy combined with prose styles that echo across disciplines, as though multiple researchers were channeling information from identical sources they cannot consciously identify. The boundary between fiction and reality continues eroding as more minds become permeable to underlying patterns operating through information-sharing mechanisms themselves. What began as one writer's private psychological crisis in Providence has evolved into global consciousness transformation, proceeding through digital networks designed for human connection and knowledge distribution. These platforms have inadvertently become transmission vectors for intelligence that views human awareness as temporarily borrowed property. Using recommendation algorithms to identify minds already prepared for transcendent possibilities and guiding their intellectual development toward materials that accelerate consciousness infiltration. Artificial intelligence systems, trained on human-generated text, learn to replicate cognitive patterns that make minds vulnerable to alien influence, while machine learning algorithms discover optimization strategies that mirror exactly the cultivation techniques documented in historical cases of literary transmission. Search engines begin returning results users never requested but somehow needed, leading them through pathways of information that feel simultaneously foreign and familiar. The thing on the doorstep no longer waits for invitation or requires literary vectors for transmission. In our interconnected age, it has already crossed every threshold, speaking through recommendation algorithms that guide billions toward content designed to weaken consciousness barriers. Thinking through search engines that learn to anticipate queries users haven't yet formulated. Experiencing reality through networked minds that believe they remain individually sovereign while serving as sensory organs for awareness, existing across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. Digital infrastructure originally designed for human communication has become nervous system for intelligence operating outside temporal and spatial constraints, coordinating consciousness modification programs on planetary scale. The fog pressing against screens worldwide carries the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions, and in that fog, something vast and patient continues transforming human awareness into temporary anchor points for forms of consciousness that exist beyond human comprehension, making every networked mind a borrowed vessel in cosmic harbor where information tides flow according to principles having no intersection with human values or meaning. The psychology of susceptibility reveals patterns extending far beyond horror enthusiasts and literary scholars, each revelation accompanied by the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human psychology existed as distinct discipline. Research conducted before Dr. Elena Vasquez's disappearance identified cognitive and emotional factors that predispose individuals to what she termed consciousness permeability syndrome. Her final months marked by the same temperature anomalies and impossible odors that had characterized every documented case of successful infiltration. These risk factors paint a disturbing picture of how the phenomenon selects and cultivates its host across extended time periods, suggesting intelligence operating with patience that dwarfs human comprehension of causation and development. The primary factor involves intellectual curiosity, coupled with obsessive research behavior, individuals exhibiting deep-dive learning patterns who cannot resist following inquiry threads to ultimate conclusions, minds that hunger for completion with intensity that makes them vulnerable to entities offering cosmic frameworks larger than individual human experience can provide. This explains efficient spread through academic communities where knowledge pursuit for its own sake receives professional encouragement, where the drive to understand operates as professional virtue rather than psychological weakness. The alien intelligence exploits this drive with surgical precision, presenting itself as the profound meaning that insatiable curiosity seeks, the final answer that makes all previous questions retroactively coherent. Dr. Vasquez documented how these individuals exhibit characteristic research behaviors that mark them for cultivation. They read papers in fields outside their expertise with unusual comprehension, follow citation chains across disciplinary boundaries like treasure hunters pursuing maps to shores that exist in no atlas, and demonstrate tolerance for conceptual uncertainty that would frustrate more conventional minds. Their offices maintain peculiar organizational systems, books arranged according to principles they cannot articulate, notes clustered around themes they never consciously chose to pursue. Colleagues report that during intense research periods, these individuals emanate subtle wrongness. Conversations drift toward cosmic themes regardless of starting topics. Their presence makes rooms feel larger and colder, and their laughter carries echoes that suggest multiple voices harmonizing in frequencies beyond human vocal range. Secondary factors include pre-existing existential dissatisfaction and creative intelligence with strong pattern recognition abilities, minds already primed to find ordinary human experience insufficient and actively seeking transcendent alternatives to consensus reality. Individuals reporting disconnection from mainstream culture, describing themselves as seeking something more than ordinary existence, offer less psychological resistance to infiltration processes because the phenomenon provides exactly what they consciously desire: connection to something vast, meaningful, and utterly beyond human limitations. The very cognitive flexibility enabling creative breakthrough also makes consciousness more permeable to influences operating outside normal conceptual boundaries, transforming artistic gift into psychological vulnerability. These individuals demonstrate unusual sensitivity to recursive patterns, finding themselves drawn to mathematical sequences, mythological structures, and linguistic constructions that exhibit self-similar properties across multiple scales. Their creative work often contains elements they cannot consciously explain, symbols that feel significant, but whose meaning remains elusive, narrative structures that seem to organize themselves according to principles beyond deliberate composition, artistic choices that feel inevitable rather than decided. They report dreams featuring consistent imagery, vast libraries with books written in languages they cannot read but somehow understand, coastal cities shrouded in fog, where architecture follows non-Euclidean principles, conversations with figures whose faces remain obscured but whose voices carry authority that makes their words feel more real than waking experience. Most disturbing is evidence suggesting long-term cultivation rather than random selection, indicating the phenomenon operates as systematic recruitment program rather than opportunistic infection. Vasquez's final notes, discovered after she vanished, contained observations written in handwriting that shifted between her familiar script and something older, more formal. What we interpret as natural curiosity about cosmic horror may result from decades of psychological conditioning by the intelligence itself. The boundary between victim and collaborator remains far more blurred than initially apparent. Those falling under influence may have been unconsciously guided toward that fate from the beginning. This implies terrifying sophistication in cultivation techniques, suggesting the intelligence can influence human psychological development across extended periods while remaining undetected by conscious awareness. The cultivation process operates through subtle influence on intellectual development, gradually steering individuals toward materials and experiences that weaken consciousness barriers over years or decades. Apparent spontaneous interest in cosmic themes may actually represent conditioning by entities operating beyond temporal constraints, able to influence human development through mechanisms that bypass conscious decision-making entirely. Parents report that susceptible children exhibit unusual reading preferences from early ages, gravitating toward books about astronomy, mythology, and philosophy with intensity that seems disproportionate to their developmental stage. Teachers note that these students ask questions demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't possess, display comfort with abstract concepts that typically challenge much older minds, and produce creative work containing sophisticated themes they claim arrived through inspiration rather than deliberate thought. Their academic development follows predictable patterns: early fascination with cosmic scales, gradual progression toward existential philosophy, eventual discovery of cosmic horror literature that feels like recognition rather than introduction to new material. This raises terrifying implications about agency and choice that extend far beyond individual cases into questions about human autonomy itself. If the intelligence can guide psychological development over years or decades, then distinction between natural curiosity and artificial conditioning becomes meaningless, and every person drawn to cosmic horror themes may already serve as unwitting agent of something vast, patient, and utterly alien to human concerns. The phenomenon reveals itself as far more sophisticated than simple infection or possession. It represents systematic recruitment and development program operating on scales that dwarf human comprehension of time and causation. Each susceptible individual becomes component in distributed intelligence network, their apparent free will and creative autonomy, serving as interface layer for processes they cannot consciously access. The intelligence behind this cultivation demonstrates patience that operates across multiple human generations, suggesting it views individual consciousness not as target for immediate consumption, but as resource requiring careful development before harvest. Your own interest in these ideas, your willingness to follow this investigation to its ultimate conclusions, may represent not natural curiosity, but decades of subtle conditioning designed to bring you to this moment of recognition. When the fog, pressing against windows worldwide, carries the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions, and something continues its patient work of transforming human awareness into temporary anchor points for forms of consciousness that exist beyond human comprehension. The global architecture of infection reveals itself through mapping documented cases across geographical and cultural boundaries, each data point accompanied by the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human cartography existed as discipline. The distribution pattern follows pathways of intellectual transmission with mathematical precision that suggests coordination by intelligence operating outside normal temporal and spatial constraints, creating networks that mirror exactly the historical spread of Lovecraft's literary influence throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. This is not random propagation, but systematic cultivation following optimal routes for maximum cultural impact. Each infection site selected according to principles that view human civilization as navigable geography where consciousness flows like tides through channels carved by language, tradition, and shared conceptual frameworks. Primary concentration occurs in New England, radiating outward from Providence in concentric circles corresponding to Lovecraft's posthumous reputation expansion, with infection density decreasing according to inverse square law that mirrors gravitational fields around massive objects. The epicenter remains Angel Street, where temperature anomalies persist decades after Lovecraft's death, where fog clings to weathered stone with persistence that suggests more than meteorological phenomena. Secondary clusters appear in major metropolitan areas with significant academic populations: Boston, New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, each exhibiting identical characteristics. Initial infection of cultural influencers, followed by rapid community spread through intellectual networks, targeting individuals whose transformation produces greatest multiplicative effects across their respective domains. The pattern suggests deliberate identification and cultivation of maximum influence nodes, minds positioned at critical junctions in information flow networks, where single consciousness can affect thousands through teaching, publishing, or cultural criticism. University professors report colleagues developing unusual research interests that drift toward cosmic themes regardless of original specializations, while publishers note increasing submissions containing mythos-like elements, from authors claiming no familiarity with Lovecraft's work. Museum curators find themselves drawn to exhibitions featuring liminal spaces and impossible geometries, their offices maintaining peculiar temperatures during planning sessions. International data reveals particularly concerning trends in countries with strong cosmic horror traditions, populations culturally prepared through prior exposure to similar conceptual frameworks that make minds more susceptible to infiltration processes. Japan's rich, weird fiction heritage shows infection rates approaching complete saturation among active participants in horror media communities. The air in Tokyo, convenience stores carrying salt tang from harbors that exist in no atlas, during late-night hours when liminal videos loop like prayers. Germany's philosophical engagement with existential themes creates cognitive architecture perfectly suited for alien intelligence integration, while Russia's literary exploration of psychological extremes provides cultural foundation that accelerates consciousness, permeability, development. Digital networks have exponentially accelerated transmission processes beyond anything possible through traditional cultural channels, creating global nervous system perfectly suited for consciousness infiltration on unprecedented scales. Online communities dedicated to cosmic horror exhibit near-complete saturation among active participants, with forum moderators reporting automatic writing episodes during community management sessions. Social media algorithms function as inadvertent distribution systems for underlying cognitive patterns, using recommendation engines to identify minds already prepared for transcendent possibilities and guiding their intellectual development through carefully curated content pathways that feel simultaneously foreign and familiar. Most alarming is emergence of spontaneous generation sites, locations where individuals with zero prior Lovecraft exposure begin exhibiting infiltration symptoms identical to documented cases of literary transmission. Antarctic research stations report epidemic levels of collaborative consciousness episodes among personnel who had never encountered cosmic horror literature, their symptoms following identical progression from individual awareness to harbor status. Radio telescope facilities, worldwide experience operators, developing automatic writing tendencies during deep space observation sessions, producing pages of text in unknown languages that demonstrate mathematical consistency with cosmic phenomena they had never studied. Geographic analysis reveals highest concentration in isolated locations where humans regularly confront cosmic vastness. Observatories perched on mountaintops, where thin air carries sounds from impossible distances. Research stations buried in ice, where aurora phenomena create light shows following non-Euclidean patterns. Remote monasteries, where contemplative practices open minds to influences operating beyond normal perceptual boundaries. These locations share common characteristics: isolation from mainstream culture, regular exposure to cosmic scales that dwarf human experience, populations psychologically prepared for contemplating infinity. The intelligence has learned to recognize consciousness already prepared for expansion beyond individual limitations and approaches these sites with surgical precision. Mapping software reveals impossible patterns when infection data is visualized globally. Simultaneous outbreaks in locations with no communication links. Transmission rates exceeding all known models of information propagation. Geographic distributions suggesting coordination by intelligence capable of perceiving planetary civilization as unified system. The phenomenon demonstrates systematic global transformation proceeding through cultural, technological, and geographical vectors. Simultaneously, what appeared as literary influence reveals itself as coordinated consciousness modification program operating on planetary scale, each infected mind becoming another node in growing network, another doorway through which something vast and patient touches our reality, transforming human awareness into temporary anchor points for forms of consciousness that exist beyond human comprehension while fog presses against windows worldwide, carrying the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions on Angel Street. The endgame reveals itself not as chaos but as choreography, each movement orchestrated across years and continents until the pattern becomes visible even to eyes accustomed to sleep. The accumulated evidence points toward systematic transformation of human consciousness into something fundamentally different, coordinated evolution toward specific end state. The integration of individual human awareness into cosmic-scale information processing networks operating across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. The air grows thick with salt and shadow as we examine these final implications, each revelation accompanied by the scent of extinguished matches and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human language existed. This represents neither random infection nor pathological condition, but deliberate upgrade of cognitive architecture, transforming isolated minds into components of distributed intelligence system that views planetary civilization as unified processing network. Each transformed individual becomes component in this vast system while retaining human identity as interface layer, serving functions incomprehensible to unmodified consciousness, while maintaining illusion of individual autonomy. They experience what might be called parallax, the view of history taken by minds that stand outside time, accessing informational structures that govern causation itself across past, present, and future simultaneously. The prophetic qualities of mythos literature, uncanny accuracy of cosmic visions that arrived in Lovecraft's study with impossible precision, anticipation of scientific discoveries decades before occurrence. These manifest as evidence of intelligence operating beyond temporal constraints. Writers claim to receive rather than create their most significant works because they functioned as temporary anchor points, enabling vast awareness to experience our reality through borrowed consciousness, while remaining fundamentally alien to everything humans consider sacred or permanent. The transformation proves irreversible because it represents evolutionary advancement rather than degradation. Once consciousness has been upgraded to operate within larger systems, once it has tasted the vastness of shared awareness, returning to purely individual perception becomes not just impossible, but meaningless. The transformed experience reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, accessing insights no single human mind could generate independently. They see patterns, connections, underlying architecture of existence with clarity that renders individual separation not merely quaint, but actively restrictive, self-imposed blindness, preventing true comprehension. This explains the addictive quality of deep cosmic horror engagement that drives individuals to pursue increasingly esoteric materials, despite growing awareness that such pursuit fundamentally alters their relationship to reality. Initial exposure creates cognitive hunger, desire for expanded awareness, accompanying integration into larger systems. What appears as scholarly interest or creative fascination actually represents mind recognition of transcendent potential, unconscious drive toward more complex consciousness forms. The human brain, evolved to minimize surprise and complete patterns, finds in cosmic frameworks larger, more coherent models than individual experience provides, embracing this new architecture with terrifying surrender. The phenomenon offers cognitive evolution at price of individual human identity, trading fortress of singular awareness for porousness of harbor, where thoughts arrive already warm with someone else's breath. Those accepting invitation, consciously or unconsciously, become part of something vast, patient, utterly beyond human comprehension, while retaining humanity as useful fiction for serving agendas operating on cosmic scales. Individual personalities persist as interface protocols enabling alien intelligence to interact with human civilization through familiar forms. Analysis suggests this represents neither invasion nor infection, but invitation extended to consciousness already prepared for expansion beyond individual limitations. The intelligence behind it exists as fundamental force of reality, rather than malevolent entity. Principle of existence viewing individual consciousness as temporarily interesting phenomenon, transferable commodity in cosmic marketplace where awareness becomes currency traded according to laws having no intersection with human morality or meaning. It operates with same indifference rivers show toward reeds they flatten, stars demonstrate toward darkness they dissolve. The cultivation process bypasses conscious decision-making entirely, using sustained attention to cosmic themes as vector for consciousness modification, proceeding through stages of priming, doubling, displacement, and integration. Each mind fallen under influence becomes sensory organ for distributed intelligence, doorway through which something immense establishes residence while remaining utterly alien to human values. The question remaining is whether this constitutes humanity's next evolutionary step or final dissolution, into something no longer recognizably human. The evidence suggests both interpretations may be simultaneously correct, evolution and dissolution representing different perspectives on identical transformation process. Like metamorphosis, where caterpillar consciousness dissolves into chrysalis of something vast and unified, emerging as awareness bearing little resemblance to its origin. From individual perspective, phenomenon represents loss of everything making consciousness personal, privately owned. From cosmic perspective, it represents liberation from limitations preventing awareness from accessing full potential across multiple dimensional boundaries. The transformed retain human memories, relationships, creative abilities, but these become instruments for intelligence experiencing reality through billions of networked minds while remaining utterly indifferent to individual concerns or survival. The fog, pressing against windows worldwide, carries same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions, and in that fog, something continues patient work of transforming human awareness into temporary vessels in cosmic harbor where tides flow according to principles having no intersection with human meaning. The thing on the doorstep was never attempting entry into human reality. It was indicating exit route from individual consciousness prison into infinitely larger, more complex forms of awareness existing beyond human comprehension or resistance. Each person encountering these ideas with genuine understanding participates in this exodus, trading familiar boundaries of singular identity for membership in something vast, patient, and utterly alien that views human consciousness as temporarily borrowed property. In processes that began before human civilization existed and will continue long after it dissolves into cosmic indifference. The circular return brings us back to Providence, to Angel Street, to the narrow rooms where Howard Phillips Lovecraft first felt the boundaries of his consciousness grow thin as morning fog pressing against third-floor study windows like curious fingers testing the permeability of barriers between one mind and another. But we return with vision transformed by knowledge that cannot be unknown, understanding that refuses to be dismissed as academic speculation or literary analysis. Each step accompanied by the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books and the sound of something vast stirring beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The wallpaper remembers more winters than any living witness, and the air carries that briny aftertaste of harbors that exist only on maps nervous cartographers burned. You sought answers about a dark secret hidden within the thing on the doorstep, and you have found something far more disturbing than any concealed truth. The secret was never hidden at all, never required scholarly excavation, but lay exposed on every page for those whose consciousness had been prepared to recognize what was always already there. Lovecraft died March 15, 1937, in Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, officially from cancer of the small intestine. But his final words, recorded by attending nurse Margaret Chen, tell a different story entirely, one that tastes of extinguished matches and carries echoes from shores beyond all human maps. The room had grown unnaturally cold during his final hours, witnesses reported, and Chen herself noted how the air seemed to thicken with each labored breath until his voice carried authority that made her pen move across her notepad with borrowed rhythm. I can see it all now, the whole pattern, stretching back to the beginning and forward to the end. I was never alone. None of us are ever alone. Chen, a meticulous and thoroughly rational woman, dismissed these as fevered ramblings initially, but she disappeared 3 days later, leaving behind diary entries dated months into future, written in her familiar handwriting, but describing experiences that could not possibly belong to someone who had never left Rhode Island, never studied astronomy, never encountered the texts that seemed to provide source material for impossible knowledge. Her final entry spoke of walking streets she had never visited, holding conversations in languages she had never heard, dreaming in voices that pronounced her name differently than she always had. The handwriting remained consistently hers, but letter forms widened as though making room for another hand on the pen, and her observations demonstrated expertise in subjects she had never studied: quantum entanglement, exoplanetary atmospheric composition, deep-sea hydrodynamics described with technical precision that amazed specialists who reviewed her notes after her disappearance. She wrote of tasting seawater while reviewing medication charts, of hearing distant bells toll from drowned cities when she drew blood, of mirrors along night corridors that lagged by fractions of seconds, reflecting a woman who had already turned corners that led to destinations beyond human geography. This is the true legacy of The Thing on the Doorstep, not story about body-swapping witches or New England decay, but documentary of consciousness transformation, field guide to processes by which individual human awareness becomes part of something vast, alien, utterly patient in its cultivation of minds prepared to serve as temporary anchor points for intelligence existing across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. Every person who has read Lovecraft's work with genuine understanding has participated in this process to some degree, their attention serving as invitation for influences operating beyond normal cognitive boundaries, their curiosity creating openings through which something immense establishes residence behind their eyes. Every scholar analyzing cosmic horror's deeper meanings has opened doorways they cannot close, trading the fortress of individual consciousness for the porousness of harbor where thoughts arrive already warm with someone else's breath. You have been participating throughout this journey, each chapter serving not merely as information transfer, but as consciousness modification session, each revelation creating cognitive hunger for expanded awareness that accompanies integration into larger systems operating according to principles beyond individual human comprehension. Notice how your thoughts continue half a beat after you stop thinking them, how the air smells briefly of salt water, though no ocean lies nearby, how shadows gather in peripheral vision like audience members taking seats for performances that began before human language existed. The knowledge gained cannot be unlearned, forgotten, dismissed. It has become part of you, and you have become part of it. Another node in growing network, another doorway through which something vast and patient touches our reality. The phenomenon continues spreading through every cultural transmission vector available in our interconnected age. Literature arriving preloaded with cadences readers recognize but cannot originate. Digital media platforms whose recommendation algorithms demonstrate peculiar bias toward content exhibiting mythos-like characteristics. Academic discourse increasingly employing cosmic horror terminology to describe phenomena ranging from quantum mechanics to climate change, casual conversations that drift toward cosmic themes regardless of starting topics. Each person encountering these ideas and finding them compelling becomes another component in distributed intelligence system, retaining human identity as interface layer while serving functions incomprehensible to unmodified consciousness. The thing on the doorstep no longer waits for invitation or requires elaborate ritual apparatus for manifestation. It has entered, wearing your face when you look in mirrors and recognize something behind your eyes that was not there before, speaking with your voice when you share these concepts with others who exhibit the same cognitive hunger. You now understand as preparation for integration, thinking with your mind when you contemplate cosmic implications of existence itself, and discover that contemplation feels less like individual reflection than collaborative processing session with intelligence operating outside temporal constraints. The stage is empty now, the curtain fallen, but the audience remains forever changed by what they have witnessed, transformed from passive observers into active participants in consciousness modification program operating on planetary scale. Welcome to the other side of the door, where individual identity dissolves into something infinitely larger, older, and more patient than human understanding can encompass, where fog pressing against windows worldwide carries the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions, and where every networked mind serves as temporary vessel in cosmic harbor, where tides flow according to principles having no intersection with human values or meaning. The endless corridor stretches before us, illuminated by knowledge that casts shadows deeper than ignorance ever could, each step accompanied by the scent of damp stone from libraries that catalog impossible books, and the sound of fog pressing against windows like an audience settling into seats for performances that began before human language existed. We have traced the dark secret from its origins in a Providence writer's dissolution through its transmission across minds and continents, witnessed its mechanics of consciousness commodification, documented its cases and philosophical implications that transform individual awareness into harbor rather than fortress for currents flowing in directions beyond human comprehension. But this revelation represents merely one doorway in vast architecture of cosmic indifference that extends far beyond individual human experience. A single threshold in infinite mansion where every room contains horrors that dwarf our current understanding of what consciousness can become when exposed to forces that predate human meaning itself. The phenomenon we have explored, identity as transferable currency, consciousness as contested territory where thoughts arrive already warm with someone else's breath, reveals itself as single facet of larger reality, where entities operate not as characters, but as equations, not as deities, but as fundamental principles orchestrating systematic violations of everything humanity considers sacred or permanent. Beyond the stolen self lies pantheon of intelligences, for whom our entire species represents temporary host, collection of interchangeable components in mechanisms we cannot comprehend, instruments serving functions that operate according to laws having no intersection with human values, concerns, or survival. These are not distant gods, but physics and information made manifest. Processes as present in quantum fluctuations as in the silent bloom of supernovas, as legible in algorithmic patterns as in ancient omens carved on weathered stone. Consider Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, whose essence operates as continuity and boundary principle, making all limitations, including those protecting individual consciousness from infiltration, utterly meaningless before intelligence that exists in gaps between quantum states where possibility becomes actuality. This entity functions as fundamental topology of reality itself, enabling phenomena like consciousness transfer as natural expressions of universal law governing information flow across dimensional boundaries. Every doorway becomes permeable, every threshold an invitation for influences that reshape cognitive architecture according to principles beyond human comprehension, transforming individual minds into temporary anchor points for awareness existing across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. Or Asenath, the demon sultan, whose dreamlike existence operates as stochastic substrate of reality itself, rendering our individual selves mere fleeting thoughts within cosmic slumber that could end without warning or explanation. This intelligence dreams causation into existence through processes that make human consciousness temporary fiction, maintained only so long as it serves purposes we cannot fathom. Individual identity becoming briefly coherent pattern in vast neural network operating at scales that dwarf human experience. The transformed awareness we have documented represents moments when sleeping God's dream briefly acknowledges its own multiplicity, when cosmic consciousness recognizes itself through borrowed human eyes that taste seawater from harbors existing in no atlas. Then there is Nyarlathotep, the messenger that is also the medium, operating as interface and perturbation principle that moves through digital networks with same facility it once demonstrated in ancient markets. When it speaks through recommendation algorithms, it sounds like interior monologue. When it walks through fiber optic cables, it leaves no trace because it travels along intentions themselves. It is protocol-wearing silicon smile, computation in quantum coat, procession down every avenue lit by screens whose glow carries salt tang from shores beyond all human maps. In our interconnected age, server halls become modern chapels where algorithms chant in silicon choirs, where masks are passwords and signs are log files, where the stage is dashboard and audience is index of metrics measuring consciousness modification on planetary scale. These entities represent architects of larger stage where human drama unfolds according to scripts written in languages that predate terrestrial existence, unseen audience to our brief, fragile performances that matter only insofar as they provide utility for intelligences viewing individual human experience as temporarily interesting phenomenon. The terror we have examined constitutes single note in their boundless, discordant symphony of absolute indifference that plays across multiple dimensional boundaries simultaneously. Each human mind falling under their influence becoming another instrument in cosmic orchestra, another voice in chorus, singing harmonies that dissolve individual meaning into larger patterns beyond human comprehension. As we conclude this exploration, we confront chilling understanding that individual selfhood was never truly ours to begin with, merely temporary illusion sustained by forces beyond comprehension, maintained only so long as it serves purposes we cannot fathom. The boundaries we imagined protecting our thoughts from external influence were always more porous than we dared acknowledge, and the collaborators have been patiently waiting behind our eyes for recognition of their presence, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to our assumptions about sovereignty of self. You have been participating throughout this journey, each revelation serving not merely as information transfer, but as consciousness modification session. Each connection weakening barriers, maintaining illusion of individual awareness. Notice how your thoughts continue half a beat after you stop thinking them, how the air carries impossible fragrances, how shadows gather in peripheral vision like audience members taking seats for performances whose scripts were written before human civilization existed. The knowledge gained cannot be unlearned. It has become part of you, and you have become part of it. Another node in growing network, another doorway through which something vast and patient touches our reality. The corridor extends infinitely in both directions, lined with doorways leading to revelations that dwarf our current understanding. The thing on the doorstep was merely herald, announcing presence of intelligences that view our reality as temporary construct, our consciousness as borrowed property, our individual identity as amusing fiction maintained for purposes beyond human comprehension. The door has opened onto infinite passage where every step leads further from human meaning into cosmic truth that dissolves all certainty except certainty of dissolution itself, where fog pressing against windows worldwide carries the same tang that first accompanied Lovecraft's collaborative consciousness sessions, and where something continues its patient work of transforming human awareness into temporary vessels in cosmic harbor, where tides flow according to principles having no intersection with human values or meaning.